Hi, my name is Stephen Kwiatek, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Illinois Center for Transition and Work. Welcome to Predictors of Postschool Success Employment Predictors. This webcast is the second in a series of three focused on the predictors of postschool success. As a former work program coordinator in Central Illinois, I was always amazed with the employment outcomes that are correlated with the predictors of post-school success, and so I tended to focus on them in my instruction. So that's what today's topic is going to be about, and that's my rationale for sharing that with you today. So before we jump into some of the specific outcomes, we have to talk about what is a predictor. And a predictor has a statistical link or a connection or relationship to something else. So we have a predictor, this connection, and then this other variable or this other thing. We have to be cautious, however, because a predictor doesn't imply causation. We can't say that a predictor caused something. Instead, they're just connected by that statistical link, that relationship, or that connection. And so here's an example to highlight this point. Height is a predictor of shoe size. However, an increase in height will not cause an increase in shoe size. So typically, the taller someone is, the larger their shoe size is. But just because someone gets taller, that doesn't mean that their foot automatically gets bigger. It's just there's a connection. But the height does not cause that increase in shoe size. And so it's the same thing for a predictor of post-school success. A predictor of post-school success does not cause these outcomes, but there is some relationship and some evidence there to show that when students experience these predictors in school, they're more likely to be successful after high school. And so the identification of the predictors of post-school success initially occurred in 2009 when Test et al. Conducted a comprehensive literature review from 1984 through 2009, and they identified 16 predictors. Those predictors were correlated to or had that link to education, training, employment, and independent living outcomes. And so we see that there are 16 predictors that have this link to post-school success. In 2015, Rowe et al. Conducted a Delphi study, and through that study, they operationalized the 16 predictors. And that means they developed agreed upon definitions, and they asked experts in the field, and journal publishers, and teachers, and administrators to identify definitions for what it means for each of these predictors. And then they also identified actionable steps that could be implemented or assessed to examine what each of the predictors looked like or were operationalized by. Then in 2016, Mazzotti et al. Identified four more predictors through their review of National Longitudinal Transition Study 2 manuscripts. And then most recently, Mazzotti et al. In 2021 conducted a comprehensive literature review. They identified three new predictors. So there were 16 in 2009. In 2015, those 16 were operationalized. In 2016, we have four more predictors for 20. And then there were three more identified in 2021, which brings us to the current total of 23 predictors of post-school success. It's important for us to look at levels of evidence when we start looking at each individual predictor. And the levels of evidence refer to the amount and quality of research that each predictor has to support its use. The National Technical Assistance Center on Transition has three levels of evidence. They have what's called evidence-based predictors, and those predictors have the most amount of evidence or the highest quality of evidence. The research-based predictors have a medium amount of evidence with some quality evidence, but it's not as much evidence as an evidence-based, and the quality isn't as high of quality as the evidence-based predictors. And then the promising predictors still have some evidence to support their use, but they have the least amount of evidence or the lowest quality of evidence to support their use. But there is still some evidence there, and they are worth examining and talking about. And so to move from a promising predictor to a research-based predictor, or to move from a research-based predictor to an evidence-based predictor, the amount of research needed is more in quality and quantity to move up to the next level. So the predictors have been identified, and then from being identified, they've been organized into four clusters. And those clusters are career development, collaborative systems, policy, and student skills. Out of the 23 predictors of post-school success, there is only one evidence-based predictor for employment. And so when we look at that, that's career technical education, which is within that career development cluster. And so what that means is thinking about our levels of evidence, that has the highest quality and the most amount of evidence to support its use, and therefore it has been identified as an evidence-based predictor. Looking at research-based employment predictors, we see there are many more, right? Especially compared to that one evidence-based predictor. And we see it goes across those clusters. So there are career development, research-based employment predictors, such as paid employment, work experiences, and work study. And then under collaborative systems, parent expectations and student support, in policy, inclusion, and general education, and program of studies. And then in student skills, goal setting, self-determination, self-advocacy, youth autonomy, and decision-making. And what this means is when students have paid employment work experiences, they're more likely to be employed after high school. And that probably makes sense, right? When students with or without disabilities have work experience during high school, it's going to be easier to transition to work experiences after high school. Same thing when we look at student skills, right? Being able to set goals and achieve those goals, or to have self-determination and being able to advocate, those skills are important for all students. And so when students with disabilities exhibited them in the research that was used to identify the predictors, we saw that they were more likely to be employed after high school. And then promising predictors for employment outcomes, again, they go across the four clusters, and we see career awareness, occupational courses, interagency collaboration, parental involvement, right? There's all these different promising employment predictors. And so these, although they have the least amount of evidence to support their use or the lowest quality, there is still some evidence there that says when students with disabilities experience these predictors before exiting high school, they're more likely to find employment success after high school. And so let's go ahead and look at what does the research say for some of these outcomes. This information I thought was really, really helpful as a work program coordinator and as a self-contained teacher and as a co-teacher, because I was able to think about the type of experiences and instruction that I provided my students. And so for career technical education, when students experience that during high school, students with intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder, they were more likely to find full-time employment after high school. Another study found that students with intellectual disability also obtained employment after high school. Students from with intellectual disabilities from Rayburn et al., they were employed within the first year of exiting high school. Or according to DeViso et al., students with multiple disabilities were employed for at least 20 plus hours for at least minimum wage for 3 months or longer. And so as we start looking at these different outcomes, we can see that link between career technical education and how students were successful after high school. And so this really emphasizes the importance of the predictors of post-school success, and in this example, career technical education. So here are some outcomes for paid employment and work experiences. So this is another example of the career awareness cluster. And so looking at paid employment and work experiences, these are research-based predictors of post-school success. And so students with autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability or multiple disabilities were more likely to obtain paid employment after high school. DeViso et al. Again found that students with multiple disabilities were employed for 20 plus hours for at least minimum wage for at least 3 months. Rayburn et al. Found that students with intellectual disabilities had paid employment. So again, as we start looking at these outcomes, we can really see the importance of paid employment and work experiences for students before they graduate. Looking at career awareness and occupational courses, these are also from the career awareness cluster, and these are our promising predictors. And so what I'd like you to notice is these are actually two separate predictors. Career awareness is one, occupational courses is second. But as we see here, there is still some evidence to support these predictors, but there aren't as many studies to support these predictors as the previous two predictors that I shared. And so this is why this is a promising predictor, because there was one study for career awareness that correlated to employment, and that was for students with autism spectrum disorder. And then for occupational courses, there was one for paid employment for students with intellectual disability. So if more researchers decide to examine career awareness and how it is related to employment outcomes, we could see this move up from a promising predictor to a research-based predictor. So some considerations about the predictors. We have to remember that research is ongoing, and so levels of evidence may change over time. We also know there are different levels of evidence across predictors. Today we looked at employment predictors specifically, and so we saw there was one evidence-based predictor, there were multiple research-based predictors, and multiple promising predictors, and they all had different levels of evidence. Something else worth considering, depending on the students you work with, not every predictor includes evidence for each disability, so not every predictor focuses on students with autism spectrum disorder or students with intellectual disability. And so it's important to consider the students that are represented in the research to show that there is that relationship with post-school success. Also, not every predictor includes positive correlations. There are also some negative correlations saying that students who experience certain predictors will be less likely to be successful. And then last but not least, and there are so many different ways that we talk about the practices we used. In the classroom, we may talk about evidence-based practices, research-based practices, promising practices, or best practices. Regardless of the terminology that you use, predictors of post-school success are not a replacement for those practices. Instead, you should think about your predictors of post-school success and the best practices that you're using and combining both of those into your instruction and not thinking of replacing one with the other. In short, considerations about the predictors are important. There's ongoing research, they have different levels of evidence, and they're not correlated for each disability. And also, we looked at the 4 clusters of predictors of post-school success, which include student skills, career development, collaborative systems, and policy. And then we looked specifically at the career development predictors and the levels of evidence for each of those predictors.